Half the town lies dead from arsenic-laced water. The only survivor capable of riding is Sarah, 8 months pregnant and terrified. But the mining baron responsible has sent riders to ensure she never reaches the marshal. Now she must survive a brutal 200-mile chase, fighting for her town, her life, and the baby coming too soon. Sarah Brennan's eyes snapped open to the sound of retching, and she bolted upright immediately. Not gentle morning sickness, violent, guttural heaving that seemed to shake the very walls. Thomas was doubled over beside their bed, vomit streaked with blood pooling across the wooden floor. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she scrambled to help him, but his body convulsed so violently he couldn't even grip her hand. Then she heard it. The screaming. Not from one house, but from every direction, a chorus of agony rising through the dawn. The entire street was wailing, the sound tearing through the air like something inhuman. She stumbled to the window, her pregnant belly knocking against the frame, and her blood turned to ice, terror seizing her completely. Neighbors were collapsing in their yards like puppets with cut strings. Mrs. Chen, who lived directly across from them, clutched at her throat, foam bubbling from her lips. The blacksmith's children just beside Mrs. Chen's yard writhed in the dirt, while their father lay motionless beside them, already gone. In less than an hour, Hope's End had transformed from a thriving frontier town into a mass grave. Sarah's hands flew to her stomach as panic clawed up her throat. Why wasn't she sick? Then it hit her. She'd drunk nothing but rainwater for weeks, her pregnancy cravings making the well water taste like metal. That same well water every single person in town had drunk yesterday. The realization slammed into her like a physical blow. This wasn't sickness, she whispered, her eyes widening with fresh terror. This was poison. She ran through the chaos to Doc Morrison's house, her boots splashing through puddles of bile and blood. She found him slumped over his desk, trembling fingers still clutching a glass vial. His eyes were bloodshot, leaking crimson tears, but his mind was sharp enough to whisper the truth. Arsenic and cyanide. Traced it to the water supply. Deliberate contamination. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist with desperate strength. The Kellerman mining syndicate had been threatening to buy out the town for months, he rasped. They wanted the land, wanted the copper deposits beneath their homes. And when the town refused to sell, Kellerman had apparently decided to simply eliminate the problem. Thomas was barely conscious when she returned, his lips blue, his breathing shallow and wet. He tried to speak, but blood bubbled from his mouth instead of words. She pressed her forehead to his, tears streaming down her face as she made calculations that shredded her soul. Fort Garrison was 200 miles east through the Badlands. They had medicine. There. They had marshals there. They had justice there. But getting there meant 4 days of riding through hell itself while 8 months pregnant. It meant leaving Thomas here to die alone. It meant risking everything on a journey that would likely kill her and the baby both. But staying meant watching everyone she loved die, including the child growing inside her. Thomas's eyes found hers, and somehow, through the poison destroying his body, he understood. His trembling hand touched her belly one final time before his strength gave out completely. That touch was permission. That touch was goodbye. Sarah kissed his forehead, tasted his sweat and tears, and made a promise she had no idea if she could keep. She would ride. She would survive. She would make Kellerman pay for every single life he'd stolen. The sun was setting as Sarah led the town's strongest mare from the stable, her saddlebags packed with what little food and water she could scavenge. Behind her, Hope's End was dying in the golden light, and ahead of her stretched 200 miles of scorching desert, treacherous canyons, and certain death. But she climbed into that saddle anyway, her pregnant belly pressed against the horn, and urged the horse into the gathering darkness. She didn't know that 50 miles north, a telegraph wire was already humming with orders. She didn't know that Silas Cade, the most feared tracker in 3 territories, was already saddling his horse with one simple mission: find Sarah Brennan and make sure she never reached Fort Garrison alive. The mare's hooves pounded through the darkness as Sarah rode east, her body already screaming in protest. Every jolt sent lightning shooting through her swollen belly, and the baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if it knew something terrible was happening. She'd been riding for 6 hours straight, exhaustion clawing at her bones, pushing as much distance as possible between herself and Hope's End before daybreak. The night air was cold enough to sting her lungs, but she knew by noon the Badlands would transform into an oven, and she needed every mile she could steal from the darkness. She stopped at a dried creek bed to let the mare drink from her canteen and rest before continuing the brutal ride. Her hands shook as she pulled out the folded paper Doc Morrison had given her. His handwriting was barely legible, scrawled in those final moments before the poison stole his coordination. Arsenic trioxide mixed with potassium cyanide, traced to main water supply. Kellerman Mining Syndicate made threats 2 weeks prior. This is murder. His signature at the bottom was just a bloody thumbprint. Sarah stared at it, her mind racing. How had he managed to discover this under such critical conditions? But this piece of paper was the only proof that would stand up in a territorial court, the only thing that could bring federal marshals crashing down on Kellerman's empire. And she was carrying it across 200 miles of hell. For a moment she thought of Thomas and sobbed, deep, wrenching cries that tore through her chest, but she knew she still had a long way to go. She wiped her eyes, folded the paper carefully, and climbed back onto the mare. By the time Sarah was watching the sun rise over the first line of red rock canyons, Silas Cade was already 20 miles into his pursuit. Cade wasn't like other trackers. He didn't need to see footprints to know where someone was going. He read the land like a book, understood how desperate people thought, could predict their choices with unnerving accuracy. He'd tracked Apache warriors through sandstorms, found outlaws who'd had 3-day head starts, and never once lost a target. The territorial marshals had wanted to hire him for years, but Cade preferred private contracts, better pay, fewer questions, and he got to choose which side of the law he worked. Today, he was working for men who poisoned entire towns. He rode a black gelding built for endurance, carried a rifle that could drop a man at 400 yards, and packed enough supplies for 2 weeks, though he wouldn't need them. The pregnant woman was already bleeding. He'd seen the spots at her rest stop. She wouldn't last 3 days in this heat. He'd catch her by tomorrow night, finish the job, and collect his $1,000 from Kellerman. It was just business. He always delivered. He smirked, already counting the money. Sarah had no idea danger was closing in with every passing second. Her world had narrowed to surviving the next hour, then the next, then the next. The sun climbed higher, scorching her skin raw. Her dress clung to her, soaked through with sweat, her lips already cracking and bleeding despite how carefully she'd rationed the canteen. The baby had stopped kicking as hard, conserving energy maybe, or already suffering from the relentless heat. She sang to it softly, her voice hoarse and trembling. Old Shoshone lullabies her mother had taught her, promises whispered into the burning air that they'd make it through this together. By midday she'd covered 40 miles, but the mare was starting to labor, foam flecking its neck. Sarah knew she had to slow down or the horse would collapse, but slowing down meant more time in the brutal sun, more dehydration, more risk. She was already calculating if she could make it on foot if the mare died. The answer was no. Not pregnant, not in this terrain. Without the horse, they were both dead, and Hope's End would never see justice. She found shade under a rock overhang around 2 in the afternoon and forced herself to stop for an hour. The mare's sides heaved like bellows, and Sarah used half her remaining water to cool the animal down, pouring it over the horse's neck and chest. It was water she desperately needed herself, but a dead horse was more dangerous than thirst. She ate a piece of jerky that tasted like leather and tried not to think about Thomas, tried not to picture him lying in their bed, cold and still, tried not to imagine his last moments, whether he'd called for her, whether he'd understood why she had to leave. The cramping started as she remounted, not contractions, not yet, but warning pains that made her gasp and grip the saddle horn. Too early. The baby wasn't due for another month, but stress could trigger labor. She knew that. Her mother had lost 2 babies to early births brought on by harsh conditions. Sarah pressed her hand to her belly and whispered fierce promises. You stay put. You stay safe. We're not done yet. She rode into the evening, the temperature finally dropping as the sun painted the canyons gold and crimson. She'd covered 70 miles in 24 hours, an impossible pace for anyone, let alone a woman 8 months pregnant. But it wasn't enough. Behind her, riding through the same canyons with mechanical precision, Silas Cade was closing the distance. He'd found her trail, read her pace, calculated her route. By his estimation, he'd have visual contact by tomorrow afternoon, and then this job would be finished. Sarah woke to the sound of her own screaming. The cramp had seized her entire abdomen, twisting like a knife, and for 10 seconds she couldn't breathe. When it finally released, she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. False labor. Had to be false labor. She couldn't afford for it to be anything else. The mare lay collapsed beside her, a sight that sent ice through Sarah's veins. Horses didn't lie down like this unless they were dying or already gone. Sarah crawled over on hands and knees, her pregnant belly dragging through the dirt, and pressed her ear against the animal's ribs. The faint rise and fall reached her, fragile as a prayer. Still breathing, she whispered to herself, the words barely audible, just exhausted beyond anything the poor creature had ever been asked to endure. The horse needed real rest now, deep, uninterrupted rest, or it would never find the strength to stand again. But rest meant time, and time meant the gap was closing. Sarah could feel it in her bones, that primitive sense that prey animals have when predators are near. Someone was coming. She had no proof, no evidence, just an animal certainty that made her skin crawl. She scanned the horizon behind her, seeing nothing but endless red rock and empty sky. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave. 15 miles back, Cade crouched beside her campsite from the previous night. He touched the ashes of her tiny fire. Still warm. She'd left before dawn, maybe 4 hours ago. He studied the marks and said she was near. Sarah finally got the mare standing after an hour of coaxing, but the animal was weak, which she could sense. She knew with sick certainty that she had maybe one more day of riding before the horse collapsed for good. After that, she'd be on foot with 100 miles still to go. She forced herself to eat, to drink, to keep moving. The baby had gone completely still inside her, which terrified her more than the kicking had. She sang constantly now, old songs and new prayers, anything to convince herself the child was still alive. By noon, she'd reached a section of terrain that made her stomach drop. A canyon system stretched ahead, miles of twisting passages through rock walls that rose 300 feet on either side. There was only one way through, a narrow path that wound like a snake's spine. It was perfect ambush country. If someone was following her, this is where they'd strike. Sarah urged the trembling mare forward into the canyon's mouth, every nerve screaming danger. 3 hours behind her, Cade saw the canyon entrance and smirked. He knew this place. He spurred his gelding faster. He wouldn't even need to chase her anymore. He'd just ride ahead, take position, and wait, like shooting fish in a barrel. Inside the canyon, Sarah felt the walls closing in. The temperature dropped in the shade, but the air felt thick, hard to breathe. The mare's hooves echoed off stone, loud as gunshots. Every echo sounded like pursuit. She kept turning in the saddle, expecting to see a rider behind her, but the passage remained empty. Then the mare stumbled badly, nearly going down. When Sarah dismounted to check the animal's legs, she found the problem. It had swollen. Sarah pressed her forehead against the mare's neck and felt something break inside her chest. The horse was done. They were both done. 130 miles from Fort Garrison, trapped in a canyon, on a dying horse, with a baby trying to claw its way out of her body. She heard the hoofbeats then, distant but unmistakable. Coming from behind her, echoing through the stone passage. Someone was in the canyon, someone was coming fast. Sarah didn't think. She grabbed her canteen and the doctor's testimony, slid off the dying mare, and ran. Running while 8 months pregnant was like trying to sprint underwater. Every step sent shock waves through Sarah's body, and the baby pressed down on her bladder so hard she thought she might wet herself. But terror gave her legs strength they shouldn't have had. She spotted a narrow cleft in the rock wall, barely wide enough for her swollen body. She squeezed inside just as the hoofbeats grew louder. Through the crack, she watched a man ride past on a black horse. He moved with the lazy confidence of someone who knew his prey was cornered. He wasn't even hurrying. He stopped beside her abandoned mare, studied it for a moment, then dismounted. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Mrs. Brennan?" His voice was calm, almost friendly. "I know you're close, your horse is still warm, and there's fresh blood on the saddle. You're hurt, and you can't run far in your condition." He pulled a rifle from his saddle scabbard. "My name is Silas Cade. I've been hired to ensure you don't reach Fort Garrison. Nothing personal." His eyes swept left, right, behind, every shadow. He could feel it. Sarah was out there, watching. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. This wasn't a random traveler. This was an assassin. Kellerman had sent a killer after her. "I can make this quick and painless," Cade continued, walking slowly along the canyon floor, scanning the rock walls. "Or you can keep hiding and make it difficult. Either way, the outcome is the same. You're not leaving this canyon alive." He getting closer. Sarah could see his face clearly. Middle-aged, weathered, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much death to be bothered by more. This was a man who killed for money without mercy. 10 feet. He was looking right at the cleft where she hid, and Sarah realized he'd seen her. He was just playing with his prey now, savoring the moment before the kill. He raised the rifle. Sarah bolted from the cleft, running perpendicular to him, and Cade's shot went wide, sparking off rock. He cursed and chambered another round, but Sarah had already scrambled behind a boulder. Her only advantage was knowing he wanted her dead, which meant she had nothing left to lose. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Cade called out. "Why prolong the suffering?" Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy looking at his horse. The black gelding stood 30 feet away, reins hanging loose, laden with supplies and water. A fresh, strong horse that could cover 100 miles without breaking a sweat. Her only chance. She waited until Cade was committed to his flanking position, his back partially turned, then made her move. She burst from cover and ran straight for the horse, her pregnant belly swaying, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She heard Cade shout, heard the crack of his rifle, felt the bullet pass so close to her head it burned her ear. But she reached the gelding. She pulled herself up with strength born of pure desperation, her swollen body fighting her every inch. The horse startled and began to move, and Sarah kicked it hard. The gelding took off at a gallop just as Cade's next shot tore through the space where she'd been seconds before. Sarah clung to the saddle like a tick, her body screaming, the baby thrashing inside her in protest of the violent motion. Behind her, Cade stood in the middle of the canyon, watching his horse disappear around a bend with his target on its back. For the first time in his career, prey had become predator. She'd stolen his horse, his supplies, his water, and now she had a real chance of making it to Fort Garrison. This had just become personal. He made sure that when he caught her now and he would catch her, it wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be painless. She'd made him look like a fool, and he'd make sure she paid for that before she died. Sarah rode for 3 hours straight before her body forced her to stop. The cramping had returned with a vengeance, waves of pain that made her double over in the saddle. When she finally dismounted beside a dried creek bed, her legs gave out completely and she collapsed in the sand. The contractions were real now. She could tell the difference. These weren't false labor pains or stress cramps. These were the kind that meant the baby was coming whether she was ready or not. She timed them with shaking hands. Her water hadn't fully broken yet, her body preparing for something that would kill them both if it happened out here. She forced herself to inventory Cade's supplies. 2 full canteens, jerky, hardtack, ammunition for a rifle she'd left behind in her panic, a bedroll, a hunting knife, and tucked in the saddlebag something that made her breath catch, a small bottle of laudanum, enough to dull the pain when the baby came, if she lived that long. She allowed herself 30 minutes of rest, then climbed back into the saddle. Her body screamed in protest. The baby kicked once, hard, right against her rib cage, and Sarah took it as a sign. Still alive, still fighting. They'd both keep fighting. By nightfall, she'd put another 20 miles behind her, but the contractions were coming every 4 minutes now. She could barely stay in the saddle. Her vision kept blurring, and twice she nearly passed out from the pain. When she finally stopped for the night, she couldn't build a fire. Cade would see the smoke for miles. She huddled in the dark with Cade's bedroll wrapped around her shoulders, shivering despite the day's heat, and felt utterly alone. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. Then another answered. Sarah's hand found the hunting knife and held it tight. If animals came, she'd fight. If Cade came, she'd fight. If death itself came walking across the Badlands, she'd spit in its face and keep moving. Thomas was gone. Hope's End was dying. But this baby would live. She'd crawl the last 100 miles on her hands and knees if she had to. The contractions woke her twice during the night, so intense she bit through her lip to keep from screaming. By dawn, Sarah pulled herself back into the saddle and urged the gelding forward. Fort Garrison was still 80 miles away. The baby was coming in hours, maybe less. Sarah kicked the horse into a gallop. Behind her, Cade had covered 30 miles on foot through the night, running on rage and professional pride. He'd found where she'd camped, seen the blood, read the signs. She was in active labor now. She wouldn't make it to Fort Garrison. She'd stop somewhere ahead, forced to by biology, and when she did, he'd be there. This hunt was almost over. The contraction hit so hard Sarah screamed and nearly fell from the saddle. The gelding spooked sideways, and she grabbed the horn with both hands, her knuckles white. When the pain finally receded, she was gasping like she'd been underwater. 2 minutes since the last one. The baby was coming now, ready or not. She spotted a narrow canyon ahead, rocks forming natural shelter, and knew she had no choice. She couldn't give birth on horseback. She dismounted clumsily, her legs barely holding her weight, and led the gelding into the canyon mouth. The walls rose 50 feet on either side, offering shade and protection from wind. It would have to be enough. Sarah spread the bedroll on the ground and lowered herself onto it, her dress already soaked with blood and fluid. Her water broke completely, gushing hot between her legs, and another contraction seized her so violently she couldn't breathe. She used the time to prepare. Knife within reach. Canteen close by. The laudanum she left untouched because she needed to stay alert. Whatever happened next, she had to be conscious and aware. The next contraction hit, and she bit down on her belt to keep from screaming. Somewhere out there, Cade was listening for her. Screaming would bring him running. Her body was in a hurry, pushing the baby out fast and hard like it knew they were in danger. Sarah braced her feet against a rock and pushed when her body demanded it, sweat and tears mixing on her face. She thought about Thomas, about Hope's End, about all the people depending on her to survive this. She thought about her mother, who died giving birth to her brother in a cabin just as isolated as this canyon. History trying to repeat itself. Then she heard it. A sound that turned her blood to ice, the click of a rifle being cocked. She looked up through the haze of pain and saw him. Silas Cade stood at the canyon entrance 30 feet away, his rifle aimed at her chest. He was on foot, covered in dust and sweat, and his eyes were dead calm. "End of the line, Mrs. Brennan," he said. Another contraction hit, and Sarah couldn't stop the scream this time. It tore out of her throat, raw and animal. Through the pain, she saw Cade take a step closer, his finger on the trigger. He was going to shoot her while she gave birth. He was going to kill her and the baby in the same moment. The contraction peaked, and Sarah felt the baby crown. She reached down and felt the head slick and warm. So close. The baby was so close to being born. Cade aimed at her head. "I'll make it quick. You've earned that much." Sarah's hand found the hunting knife. Her body was splitting in half, her vision going black at the edges, but her fingers closed around the handle. The baby's head emerged fully, and Sarah pushed with everything she had left. Cade pulled the trigger. The shot echoed off canyon walls like thunder. But Sarah had already moved, rolling sideways with impossible strength, the baby half-born and screaming. The bullet hit rock where her head had been. She came up with the knife in her hand and pure maternal rage in her eyes. The baby slid free, attached by the cord, wailing its fury at the world. Sarah cut the cord with one slash, wrapped her newborn daughter against her chest with her left arm, and faced Cade with the blade in her right hand. "You want us?" she snarled. "Come and take us." Cade chambered another round, but Sarah was already moving. She dove behind a boulder as the second shot ricocheted off stone, fragments stinging her cheek. The baby screamed against her chest, tiny fists flailing, alive and furious. Sarah pressed her daughter close and felt something fundamental shift inside her. Fear disappeared. Pain disappeared. All that remained was a killing instinct older than civilization itself. Cade approached carefully, rifle raised, scanning for movement. He'd hunted dangerous men before, outlaws who'd killed dozens, but he'd never hunted a woman who'd just given birth. He made the mistake of thinking she'd be weak. He made the mistake of thinking she'd surrender. Sarah waited until he was 10 feet from her hiding spot, then threw the knife. Her aim was off, weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, but the blade caught him across the forearm. Cade cursed and dropped the rifle. In that half-second of distraction, Sarah charged. She hit him like a wildcat, all teeth and nails and desperate strength. The baby somehow still clutched against her with one arm while she clawed at his eyes with the other. Cade stumbled backward, shocked by the ferocity of her attack. He outweighed her by 80 pounds and had trained in hand-to-hand combat with cavalry soldiers. But Sarah was fighting with the primal fury of a mother protecting her child, and that made her terrifying. They crashed to the ground together. Cade got his hands around her throat and squeezed. Sarah's vision dimmed, red spots dancing across her eyes. The baby was screaming, caught between their bodies. With the last of her strength, Sarah's hand found a rock and swung it into Cade's temple. The blow stunned him enough to loosen his grip. Sarah rolled away, gasping for air, blood streaming from between her legs. Cade shook his head, trying to clear it, and reached for his rifle. Sarah got there first. She didn't know how to shoot, had never fired a gun in her life, but she pointed it at his chest and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly broke her shoulder. The bullet took Cade high in the chest, spinning him around. He fell to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt, and looked at her with something like respect in his dying eyes. "You actually did it," he whispered. Then he collapsed forward and went still. Sarah stood there for a long moment, the rifle trembling in her hands, the baby wailing against her chest. She'd killed a man, taken a life. But as she looked down at her daughter's face, red and scrunched and furiously alive, she felt no guilt, only grim satisfaction. She stumbled back to the bedroll and collapsed, her body finally acknowledging the damage. She delivered the afterbirth with shaking hands, wrapped the baby in Cade's shirt, and tied off the cord properly. Her daughter latched onto her breast and began to nurse, making small, satisfied sounds. Sarah looked at the body in the canyon, then at the gelding waiting patiently nearby. 50 miles to Fort Garrison. Maybe 2 days if she rode slow. But she couldn't ride yet. Her body needed rest, needed to recover from the trauma of birth and battle. She had maybe 6 hours before she bled out or infection set in. 6 hours to decide if she'd die here beside her enemy or find the strength to finish what she'd started. The baby finished nursing and fell asleep in her arms. Sarah looked down at that tiny, perfect face and made her choice. She hadn't survived this long to quit now. Thomas and 47 others were counting on her. This baby, her daughter, deserved to grow up knowing her father's name and the town he'd died defending. Sarah wrapped the baby in a sling against her chest, pulled herself upright using the canyon wall, and walked toward the gelding. Every step left bloody footprints in the sand. Sarah made it 3 miles before she fell off the horse. She didn't remember hitting the ground, only waking up face down in the dirt with the baby screaming somewhere above her. The gelding had stopped and was standing over them both, as if the animal understood they were all in this together now. Getting back in the saddle took 20 minutes. Her legs wouldn't work properly and her arms had no strength. She had to use a rock as a mounting block, pulling herself up inch by agonizing inch while the baby wailed in the sling. Once mounted, she tied herself to the saddle horn with her belt because she knew she'd fall again. Her body was shutting down, running on fumes and will alone. The sun climbed higher and the heat became crushing. Sarah's dress was stiff with dried blood, and fresh blood still seeped down her legs with every mile. She was hemorrhaging, had been since the birth, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She'd packed cloth between her legs as best she could, but it was soaked through within the hour. The baby nursed when she could, small, desperate pulls that left Sarah's breasts aching and empty. She wasn't producing enough milk, her body too damaged to do everything at once. The infant's cries grew weaker as the day wore on, and that terrified Sarah more than her own approaching death. She could accept dying. She couldn't accept her daughter dying before reaching safety. She hallucinated for hours, saw Thomas riding beside her, smiling and whole, saw her mother walking through the desert in her Shoshone dress, singing the old songs, saw Hope's End rebuilt and thriving, children playing in streets where corpses had lain. The visions felt more real than the pain, and Sarah had to keep pinching herself to stay anchored to the present. Night fell, and she kept riding. The stars came out in their thousands, cold and distant and indifferent to her suffering. The gelding stumbled frequently now, exhausted beyond endurance. Sarah sang to keep them both awake, her voice cracked and raw. Lullabies for the baby. Trail songs her father had taught her. Anything to fill the silence. Dawn broke on the 4th day and Sarah saw it. A smudge on the horizon that might have been clouds or heat shimmer, but her heart knew better. Fort Garrison. She was close. So impossibly, miraculously close. The gelding sensed it too and found reserves of strength neither of them knew existed. The horse broke into a trot, then a canter, carrying its dying rider toward salvation. Sarah clung to consciousness with everything she had. The baby was silent in the sling, and Sarah couldn't tell if that meant sleeping or worse. She didn't dare look. 2 miles from the fort, the gelding's legs finally gave out. The horse went down hard, and Sarah rolled free by instinct, protecting the baby with her body. They lay there in the sand, woman and infant and dying horse, all three breathing in ragged gasps. Sarah could see the fort walls clearly now, could see the flag flying above the gates, could see soldiers moving on the ramparts. So close. 100 yards might as well have been 100 miles. She couldn't walk, could barely crawl. But she had Doc Morrison's testimony still tucked in her dress, stained with blood but intact. She looked down at her daughter's face. The baby's eyes were open, dark, and aware, looking up at her with perfect trust. Sarah kissed that tiny forehead and started crawling. One hand forward, pull. Other hand forward, pull. Dragging herself through the dirt with her daughter against her chest and justice clutched in her fist. The fort gates were opening. Soldiers were running toward her. Sarah heard shouting, felt hands lifting her, heard someone say, "Dear God, she's barely alive." She thrust the paper at whoever was holding her and whispered through cracked lips, "Hope's End, poisoned, Kellerman Mining Syndicate." Then the world went black. Sarah opened her eyes to white ceiling boards and the smell of carbolic soap. The fort infirmary. She tried to sit up, and pain exploded through her body, forcing her back down. A woman's face appeared above her, kind eyes and a weathered face, the fort surgeon's wife. "Easy now. You've been unconscious for 3 days, lost more blood than any person should survive." The woman pressed a cool cloth to Sarah's forehead. "Your daughter is fine, healthy and hungry. The surgeon's been feeding her goat's milk." Sarah's hands flew to her chest, finding it empty, and panic seized her throat. "Where is she?" "Right here." The woman lifted a small bundle from a nearby cradle. The baby was wrapped in clean white cloth, sleeping peacefully, her tiny face pink and perfect. Sarah took her daughter with trembling arms and felt something break loose in her chest. They'd made it. Against impossible odds, they'd both survived. "The testimony you brought," the woman continued, her voice careful. "The commander read it, sent riders to Hope's End immediately with medicine and federal marshals." She paused, and Sarah saw the truth in her eyes before the words came. They got there as fast as they could, but the poison worked quick. Most of the town was already gone. Sarah closed her eyes. She'd known. Deep down, she'd known Thomas was dead before she even left, but hearing it confirmed felt like losing him all over. Again. How many? 47 survived, mostly children and a few adults who'd been away from town when the water was poisoned. The marshals arrested 5 men from the Kellerman Mining Syndicate. They're facing federal murder charges. The woman's hand found Sarah's shoulder. "Your husband was among those who didn't make it. I'm sorry. The riders said he died the second day." Sarah held her daughter tighter and let the tears come. Thomas would never meet this baby, would never know she had his eyes, his stubborn chin, would never hear about the desperate ride across the Badlands or the fight in the canyon. He died believing she might not make it, died without knowing if his sacrifice had meant anything. But it had meant something. 47 people were alive because she'd ridden. Kellerman's empire was crumbling because she delivered that testimony. Her daughter existed, breathing and warm, because she'd refused to surrender. "What will you do now?" the woman asked gently. Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms. "Go back. Hope's End will need rebuilding. Those 47 survivors will need help starting over." She touched her daughter's cheek. "And she deserves to grow up knowing the town her father died defending." "The commander wants to see you when you're strong enough. Says there's talk of making your ride official record, calling you a hero." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother who refused to let her baby die in the desert." She paused. "What day is it?" "August 10th. 4 days since she'd left Hope's End. 4 days that had aged her a lifetime." Sarah looked at her daughter and realized she hadn't named her yet. Thomas had wanted to call a girl Grace if they had one. Grace for the mercy they'd found in each other. 2 broken people learning to be whole. "Her name is Grace," Sarah said quietly. "Grace Thomas Brennan." The woman smiled. That's a strong name. She'll need it, growing up with a mother like you. Over the next week, Sarah's strength slowly returned. The surgeon marveled that she'd survived at all, said she'd lost enough blood to kill most men. But frontier women were made of tougher stuff than most men, Sarah thought. They had to be. The fort commander visited on the 8th day brought news that felt like vindication. The federal marshals had uncovered documents proving Kellerman had ordered the poisoning. 6 executives were in custody, including Kellerman himself. They'd hang for what they'd done. You brought justice for 300 people, the commander said. That testimony you carried across 200 miles is the only thing that will hold up in court. Without it, Kellerman would have walked free. Sarah looked at Grace, asleep in her arms. I didn't do it for justice. I did it so she'd have a future worth living. Sarah rode back into Hope's End 6 weeks later with Grace strapped to her chest and a federal escort of 4 soldiers. The town looked like a graveyard. Empty houses, with doors hanging open, unfinished projects abandoned mid-task. The main street was silent, except for wind moving through buildings like the breath of ghosts. But in the town square, 47 people waited. Women who'd been out gathering herbs when the water was poisoned, children who'd been playing by the creek, 3 men who'd been hunting in the hills. They'd buried their dead and stayed, refusing to abandon the land their families had died for. When they saw Sarah riding in with the baby, they erupted in cheers. An old woman named Ruth Hartley, who'd lost her husband and 3 sons, stepped forward. We heard what you did. Heard you rode 200 miles pregnant and fought off a killer. Heard you crawled the last mile with a newborn in your arms. Her voice cracked. You saved us, Sarah. Every person standing here is alive because you wouldn't quit. Sarah dismounted, her body still weak but healing. I didn't save enough. Thomas is gone, Doc Morrison, Mrs. Chen, half the children. I was too slow. You were fast enough, Ruth said firmly. And because of you, Kellerman is going to hang. Because of you, his whole operation is being torn down. The law is seizing his mines, his money, everything. Your ride changed things beyond just Hope's End. Over the following months, Sarah watched the town slowly rebuild. The survivors pooled their resources and brought in new families. The territorial governor, embarrassed by how close Kellerman had come to getting away with mass murder, provided funds for reconstruction. By winter, Hope's End had a new well, tested weekly for contamination and a population of 80. Sarah built a small house on the edge of town, close enough for community but far enough for peace. She decorated it with Thomas's tools and his favorite saddle blanket. Every evening she'd sit on the porch with Grace and tell stories about the father the baby would never remember, about his kindness and his courage and the town he'd loved enough to die for. The story of Sarah's ride spread across the territory like wildfire. Newspapers called her the mother of the Badlands. Politicians cited her journey as proof of frontier resilience. But Sarah didn't care about fame or recognition. She cared about Grace learning to walk in the garden. She cared about Hope's End surviving another winter. She cared about making sure Thomas's sacrifice meant something lasting. On Grace's first birthday, the town gathered to rename itself. They lived with too much death to keep calling the place Hope's End. Ruth Hartley proposed the new name, and it passed by unanimous vote. They'd call it Grace, after the baby born in blood and fire, and after the mercy that Sarah had shown them all by refusing to let them be forgotten. Sarah stood in the town square that day holding her daughter and felt Thomas's presence like sunlight. He'd died believing in this place, believing the people here were worth saving. She'd proven him right. And every day for the rest of her life, she'd make sure Grace knew that her existence had been purchased with the highest price and that she carried the hopes of 300 souls in her name. Years later, when Grace was old enough to understand, Sarah would take her daughter out into the Badlands. They'd ride to the canyon where she'd given birth and fought for their lives. Sarah would show her the rocks still stained with blood, tell her about the desperate choices and impossible odds, and she'd teach her daughter the most important lesson the frontier had to offer, That love, real love, isn't soft or gentle or easy. Sometimes love means riding 200 miles through hell. Sometimes it means fighting killers while giving birth. Sometimes it means choosing to live when dying would be so much simpler. Sarah had learned that lesson in blood and pain, and she'd pass it down to her daughter, along with the name of the man who'd made it all matter. Thomas Brennan, who touched her belly one last time and given her permission to survive. If this story moved you, click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of courage and survival. Leave a comment telling us what you thought about Sarah's journey. Tomorrow, we'll share another story that will leave you breathless.